Hey, what's up guys? My name is Josh, and today we're going to be talking about the Darkvoice 336 SE. Now I actually partnered with an online audio store called Appos to make this video possible, so I want to thank them for sending this out. You'll find links to this and their store in the description down below. So this thing is a little bit of a conundrum to me. This has seemingly stayed around in a world of ever-evolving measurements, ever-evolving tech, kind of stuck in the Stone Ages, but the funny thing about this is that that's exactly the reason to buy this. This boasts measurements that are, by today's standards, for the price, kind of terrible, to be honest. And it's a little bit finicky and fiddly, but it's still a very fun thing to own, which is very strange. Okay, so all that being said about the measurements and stuff like that, who is purchasing these and why might you be interested? Well, the people who are purchasing these are people who want the specific sound quality that this offers. The measurements are so bad that this thing has a pretty distinct sound signature, but it actually, depending on the pairing, is quite enjoyable. And sometimes this thing is so enjoyable to listen to that I would actually prefer it over some of the top measuring amplifiers right now. Now I'll get into sound in a little bit. First, I want to cover the build. Most impressive part about the build is the amount of product that you get for your money. This is $259, and this is by far the most substantially hefty chunk of metal that I think you can buy for $250 in the audio world. This thing is hefty and tanky and just heavy. It's heavy duty for real. Now, in terms of opening a box and feeling like you got your money's worth, this has that feeling in spades. This thing feels very substantial. So despite the size, and you see the two tubes in the front and the transformer on the top that on the metal shroud has Darkvoice, Orphean Sound, Audio Video Lab, I believe it's Chengdu, on this metal stamp on top of this metal casing on top of this metal chassis. On the back, you have RCA inputs and RCA pre-outs, as well as your power input. On the front, your on and off switch, which is extremely satisfying, probably the best. Your volume knob, which has its own characteristics, which we'll talk about in a second. And then your 1/4 inch output. This is a single-ended only amp, which is the SE portion. And so overall, this is actually pretty simple despite it being so big. So a couple notes on the build here and one quirk. So these are old school tubes. They are swappable, obviously, and that's a big thing that owners of the Darkvoice like to do. I will say this, even though I think that the stock version of this is very good sounding for what it's intended to do, the tube sound variance out of this is massive. So even if you don't like the stock tubes, you can change the tubes up quite a bit to maybe get something a little bit less tube sounding or a little bit more tube sounding, super dark, super warm, even bright if you want to. And you can really tailor the sound, and the cost can be pretty cheap or it can be pretty expensive. So you can really tune this thing in a few different ways. This does get quite hot, but one weird quirk of part of that heat is when you get this and it's cold, the volume knob in the front, the potentiometer, is actually a little bit stiff, and it has like a really solid amount of resistance to it when you first plug it in if you're in a cold state like I am. But then once you turn it on and you leave it on, after a couple minutes, it will actually soften up a little bit and be much easier to turn. Kind of odd, but something I noticed. Okay, so like I said, the specs of this they're really, really not designed to be any sort of spec king, right? This is a shit Magnus. This is probably the cleanest balanced amp that you can buy at $200. And these are kind of polar opposite devices, right? This is supposed to be sleek, super modern, got all like the newest components for the price, and it results in a very good sounding solid state amp. Now this is older school and isn't really focused so much on the measurement side, so much as kind of allowing the tube to transfer its influence into the sound, and you get that out of your headphones. But I think the interesting part comes from the power delivery versus a typical power delivery of a solid state amp. So with this amp, you get most of your power in lower impedances. So if you're at 16 ohms, you're getting like, I think it's 6 watts into 16 ohms, and then it drops down steadily as you increase in impedance. And that downgrading of power versus impedance is sort of flipped on the 336 SE, sort of. This thing doesn't do so hot at lower impedances. So your power output of this at 33 ohms is drastically less than your power output at 300 ohms. And that mostly has to do with how these two handle amperage and voltage differently. Now, I'm not going to get too technical into explaining all of that, but I will say this. higher impedance headphones are going to do better on this than lower impedance headphones. Now, because this thing is so specific in its use case, to talk about the sound, you have to set a couple of qualification statements in order to talk about the sound properly. So here we have an IEM, a dynamic headphone of relatively high impedance, and a planar magnetic headphone. All three of these for their class are actually fairly difficult to drive, but they're all handled very differently from the Darkvoice. So right away, there is a little bit of a tube hum for lower impedance stuff. So I think IEMs are going to be a no-go for the 336 SE. Now planars like this are relatively difficult to drive, but they have low impedance. And because this doesn't handle low impedance very well, what you'll run into with planars like this is you get to really unreasonable amounts of distortion and even some clipping in the bass response quite quickly on this amplifier. So I will hit clipping in the bass before I'm actually getting to a kind of a typical listening level in terms of volume for me personally. So planars like this are out of the equation for the most part, unless you have something that's really high impedance for a planar, which don't usually exist too much. Okay, so that leaves us with dynamics that are of high impedance. So this is a 6XX, which I believe is 300 ohm. 150 ohm headphones are going to do fine on this as well, and 600 ohm headphones are going to do great. This is this amp's bread and butter. That's what this was sort of designed to play well with, was dynamic headphones with high impedance. So your focals are going to do really well. Your higher end Sennheisers like this one or the HD800s are going to do exceedingly well. Your ZMF headphones are going to do great. Basically anything that uses a dynamic driver and is of, I would say, above 100 ohms is typically going to do phenomenally on this. So to actually describe the sound, I'm just going to be sticking with the bass unit. That way, if you get it, you can kind of know what to expect. When people talk about kind of a warm or an ooey gooey sound signature to the tubes, what they're usually referring to is some of the timbre characteristics, some of the decay characteristics, and some of the just general twisting of the sound quality towards an enjoyable level. So what this will do to vocals specifically is usually, in this particular case with the 6XX on this, is usually actually take them from being a super precise in your head sound and actually give them a decent bit of space and kind of environmental influence from the sound. Now it's almost like a very minor echo to the voice that adds a sense of space. And this, I think, is going to be one of those things where if you like it, you love it. And if you don't like it, it's just not going to be for you. I think for headphones like this that have a very intimate experience overall, this actually does really well for. But with certain headphones like an HD800, which I'm not a huge fan of that headphone's core sound signature to begin with, I don't really like the addition of this system with that, but some people actually genuinely really like the addition of this onto the HD800. It's just not for me personally. Now the bass response of the system is a bit deceiving. Sometimes it will hit harder and fuller on some dynamics, and then with others it hits a little bit thinner. Even in Sennheiser's own lineup, I get two different types of sounds out of the different bass response for different headphones. So the 6XX, I get a little bit of reduction in bass compared to that of the Magnus. But when I go over to the PC38X, I actually get an addition of bass, specifically mid bass, and that headphone becomes even warmer than it already was. And funnily enough, if you're more uptight for how you like your sound quality, this is going to sound really unappealing. But for people who have kind of seen and done it all and want to experience different things, this is actually a really appealing proposition, I think. It's specific and it's not gonna ever be like at the top of a general recommendations list, but it's still pretty good to be able to see things from a different perspective in terms of sound quality. Now, high resolution kind of jumps into the same category. So with solid state amps right now, even cheap ones, you are getting resolution in the top end that is simply astounding and probably even beyond, for the right headphones, beyond what most people are capable of perceiving. But this, in comparison to some of these solid states, actually softens that information delivery. It kind of dulls down some of the details. And this on the right headphones can actually be extremely nice and can be, it could take a lot of clinical headphones like the Bayer line and kind of cool them down a little bit in the top end and not make them super analytical. And this goes more into the classically musical sound signature that we hear so much about. So to sort of enter my long-winded conclusion here, am I, unreasonably justifying this amplifier? I would say not really. I think headphones as an overall category are made specifically for humans to enjoy them. And I think that this sound signature is actually really appealing for the right person. Maybe not for everybody. It's definitely not for the people who want the most precise sound that they can get. It's not a measurement king or anything even remotely close. But all that being said, that isn't really the point. And if those things are appealing to you, this is obviously not going to be your device. Now, I personally don't see this as a primary. I don't see it as a kind of the one amp that if you're only going to have one amp, this is the one you should get. Unless you've heard it and you just fell in love with the sound signature, I would almost always recommend pretty much any modern equivalently priced solid state amp over this as a kind of one and done scenario. This to me much more feels like a secondary option. You know, you can have your evolving change of the latest and greatest and most precise solid state amps that you change maybe every 2 years. But something like this, I feel like is more kind of meant to be a longer term option, an alternative to an existing sound system, maybe do a couple of tube swaps on it, but you mainly just want it for the slightly different shift of position on your headphones. Okay, I think that's going to be it. To sum it up in one sentence, I'm going to say not for all, but perfect for some. And that's going to be the Darkvoice 336 SE review. So thank you guys very much for watching. Until the next video, my name is Josh, signing off.